The Mahogany Clock Part 4 ended up with a question: high gloss or semi-gloss? Well, I was sort of leaning towards the high gloss, and I asked my wife what she thought, and she thought the high gloss looked best too. So that's what we're going for. We're just going to leave it as it is. So that leaves another question. Now what am I going to do with this tin of semi-gloss that I've already opened? Well, I'm going to top it off with solvent, put the lid back on with as little air in as possible, and hopefully years down the road it'll still be as good as new. Usually when I'm cutting glass for these little clock doors, I have about a 75 or better success rate. But not this time. The small door went good, and I just used a piece of glass from a picture frame that had come from the dollar store, so the piece of glass was only worth $1, but that didn't go too bad. But the bigger frame was using some old window glass. The glass must have been at least 40 years old, and I had a terrible time with it. I ended up going over to Alder Brothers Glass, and they cut a nice piece here for me. And I just ended up ruining a window, which I probably wasn't going to use anyway because I found it in the back field. But anyway, sort of a waste of time. I've already sanded the sharp edges off the small piece, and I'm just carefully doing the larger piece now. I find that if I do this, I never cut myself. I don't think it actually weakens the glass, although it might put little micro cracks in it, I'm not sure. But this works for me. Now here's something that I do feel is kind of important, and that is to clean off the edge of the glass where your fingers have been touching and there might be any grease or anything. That'll help the adhesive to adhere a lot better. I'm just using Windex here. Here I'm using silicone as an adhesive. I have used 5-minute epoxy in the past. In fact, I've got one clock in the house that's over 25 years old, and I used 5-minute epoxy, and the glass is just holding fine. However, most glass places seem to use silicone. So, here we go. In case you're wondering what that red strap is hanging around my bandsaw, well, that's to remind me to retension the blade before I throw the on switch. I'm going to give this silicone about 24 hours to cure before I put any stress on it. And so I'm going to work on my dial, and you know, I sure don't like the dial board. I think I'm just going to do it temporary until I can think of something better. Now I do like the looks of the dial itself. It looks really nice with that owl on there, and but the dial board, it just looks, I don't know, cheap. And it just doesn't match the rest of the mahogany clock. So I'm probably going to have to change that. In fact, I know I am. Now there are holes provided in this movement so that you can screw it directly to the dial board, but this dial board's a little on the thin side, and I'm afraid I might go right through and out the other side, and that wouldn't be good. So I'm putting these blocks all the way around, and that way when the batteries are being put in and taken out, the movement isn't going to twist around on the board. Being as that this is not the final dial board, I'm just using scraps here. However, when I make the good one, I'll probably do it much the same way. Another thing that's wrong with this dial board is I made it just a little bit too small, at least on the bottom, and that's why I have to drill these holes at a bit of an angle so that they'll catch on the case. This is actually the first time that I put this dial in its place, and I like what I see here. And this is also the first time that it's been reassembled since the Varathane went on. And I think it's going to look pretty good once the little glass doors are on and it's hanging up on the wall. These little rubber feet came with a speaker system, and I never used them, but they will work good to help hold the back out from the wall. I just couldn't wait. I had to find a place on the wall to hang it up and see what it looked like, and I'm pretty much impressed. And as I've already mentioned too many times, I'm not impressed with this dial board. It's time to do something about it now. Now I've been calling this a mahogany clock, and it isn't actually 100% mahogany the way it is right now, because the dial board is actually plywood, probably fir, and I want it to be 100% mahogany. So this means I'm going to have to make a mahogany dial board. That way I can say it is a solid mahogany clock. So because this mahogany is so expensive, I'm going to resaw a piece here and try and get as much out of it as I can. I'm using the jointer here to try and get the edges nice and smooth and square. That way it'll glue together a lot better. I'm resawing a piece of 3/4 inch scrap here just to get my bandsaw adjusted right before I try that expensive mahogany piece. My first test setting isn't too bad. It's a little bit off, as you can see. Board number 3 is a little bit thicker than the first two. I don't know why I'm being so exacting here. I can always run this thing through the thickness planer later, but this is kind of fun to see if I can get it close. And here we go with test number 3, and as you can see, it turned out pretty good. I wish I'd been that lucky with my glass earlier. This bandsaw is pretty good for the money, but the fence I think is just a little bit on the flimsy side here, so I've got it braced up a bit just so that it's not going to move when I'm cutting that mahogany. I don't want any margin of error there. Well, I'm happy with that. I think once I've got it run through the thickness planer, or maybe even just the drum sander, it'll be nice and flat. Here I'm making up a special jig so that the glue line squeeze out doesn't get smeared around all over the mahogany when I'm trying to clamp everything together. This system actually works really well. Then after the glue is dried, you just sort of have to slice it off. Works pretty good. This is the 3rd or 4th time now that I've used my drum sander making this mahogany clock, and there may be somebody out there that's wondering what's under the hood. Well, this is what's under the hood, and this particular model is what's called a double drum sander, and it has coarser sandpaper on the first drum and finer sandpaper on the second drum. In a basement workshop like I've got here, this is about as big as you want to get. They do come a little smaller with just a single drum, and they also come a lot bigger. This particular model has a 3 horsepower 220 volt motor, and it's also got a variable speed smaller motor which runs the conveyor. Really nice. Once it's all adjusted nice like I've got this one here, it does just a beautiful job on almost anything you put through it. Now, as you can well imagine, this machine will produce a huge amount of sanding dust real fast, and it would be in the air if I didn't have it hooked up to my dust collector. Now, this dust collector is without question the most valuable piece of equipment that I have in my shop. It's by far not the most expensive, but it is the most valuable. But enough about the machinery. Let's get back to the clock. Now, this kind of hurts. I hate to have to cover this beautiful mahogany with paint, but nobody's going to see that I did that anyway because it's going to be on the dial side of the board. Now you'll recall that this mahogany turns quite dark when it's got varathane or even 5-minute epoxy on it. And I'm afraid that the mahogany might just show through, and I don't want to take a chance here. And I want the dial to be as white and bright as possible. So here we go with the white paint. And I guess you probably figured out that now I'm going to have to print out another dial. Well, I will. It'll still have the owls, but it will be a little bit different. In fact, it'll be a bit of a surprise. You know, this mahogany clock has taken a lot longer than I thought it would. Here we are already at the end of video number 5. And I guess we're going to have to wait until number 6 now. You'll see the surprise I was talking about the dial. And also, I'm going to include some pictures that I took over the years of clocks that I built with quartz movements in them. Very simple, but they were a lot of fun to make.